The dragon is a seraphic being, not a devil. The Hebrew term seraph literally means burning one, but in the Hebrew Bible it consistently carries serpentine imagery. As the search results confirm, the word seraph/seraphim appears in passages such as Numbers 21:6, 21:8, and Deuteronomy 8 verse 15, where it refers to fiery serpents rather than angels. In Isaiah's throne vision, the seraphim are described as six-winged beings attending the divine presence, Isaiah 6:2, 6:6, and scholars note that the term likely implies fiery or serpent-like beings rather than the later Christianized image of winged humanoid angels. See paper by Robert T. Mason Ph.D. titled The Divine Serpent in Myth and Legend dated 1999. The same source highlights that ancient Near Eastern throne guardians often drew on cobra or serpent iconography, especially in Egyptian uraeus symbolism, which Isaiah's audience would have recognized. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia likewise affirms that seraph in Numbers and Isaiah refers to fiery serpents, and that seraphim were understood in Jewish theology as high-ranking celestial beings, associated with lightning, fire, and serpentine imagery. When Revelation uses the Greek term drakon, deltarokapomeganu, meaning dragon or great serpent, the description aligns far more closely with this older seraphic serpentine archetype than with the later medieval concept of the devil. The dragon of Revelation is serpentine, winged, fiery, powerful, and celestial, all traits consistent with the seraphim described in Isaiah and the fiery serpents of Numbers. Nothing in the original linguistic or cultural context requires the dragon to be a morally evil fallen angel. That interpretation emerges centuries later in Christian demonology. Stripped of that later overlay, the dragon appears instead as a territorial celestial power, a high-ranking member of the divine council whose authority, domain, and jurisdiction are threatened by the emergence of the messianic figure. This reframes Revelation 12 not as a cosmic good versus evil myth, but as a conflict between celestial authorities, consistent with Second Temple Jewish cosmology and the divine council worldview. Nothing in the original linguistic or cultural context requires the dragon to be a morally evil fallen angel. That interpretation emerges centuries later in Christian demonology. Stripped of that later overlay, the dragon appears instead as a territorial celestial power, a high-ranking member of the divine council whose authority, domain, and jurisdiction are threatened by the emergence of the messianic figure. This reframes Revelation 12 not as a cosmic good versus evil myth, but as a conflict between celestial authorities, consistent with Second Temple Jewish cosmology and the divine council worldview. The woman is covenant community, not an enemy of the dragon. In Revelation 12, the woman is not depicted as morally opposed to the dragon, but as a symbolic embodiment of Israel and the covenant community, a reading strongly supported by mainstream scholarship. The search results identify the woman with Israel, drawing on the parallel between her celestial imagery and Joseph's dream in Genesis 37, where the sun, moon, and 12 stars represent Jacob, Rachel, and the 12 tribes. This interpretation is reinforced by the fact that the woman gives birth to the male child who is destined to rule all nations with a rod of iron, a clear reference to the Messiah emerging from Israel's lineage. The woman's flight into the wilderness, where she is protected and nourished for a symbolic period, further emphasizes her status as a preserved covenant people, not a rebellious or sinful figure. She is pursued by the dragon not because she is wicked, but because she is untouchable, shielded by divine protection and belonging to a covenantal order outside the dragon's jurisdiction. The dragon's rage, therefore, is not moral indignation but frustrated authority. He fails to destroy the child, fails to harm the woman, and thus redirects his aggression toward the rest of her offspring, defined as those who keep God's commandments and hold the testimony of Jesus. In this framework, the woman and the dragon are not ideological enemies locked in a moral dualism. They represent two different spheres of authority. The woman stands for the covenant community whose destiny and protection lie with God, while the dragon represents a celestial power whose domain has been bypassed. His anger arises from loss of jurisdiction, not cosmic evil. This reading aligns with Second Temple Jewish cosmology, where conflicts between heavenly beings and covenant communities are understood as administrative or territorial disputes, not metaphysical battles between good and evil. Although those do and can happen as well. The War Scroll as the missing context. The War Scroll, 1 quadrant meter, provides one of the clearest windows into the Second Temple Jewish worldview of cosmic conflict, and its structure closely parallels the warfare imagery in Revelation 12. The text describes a final eschatological battle in which angelic commanders, human covenant warriors, and celestial armies engage the forces of Belial and the nations aligned with them. This conflict is not framed as a moral struggle between abstract good and evil in the later Christian sense, but as a clash between factions of divine beings, each possessing distinct jurisdictions, roles, and territorial claims. The War Scroll explicitly states that on the appointed day, the congregation of the gods and the congregation of men shall engage one another, revealing a worldview in which heavenly and earthly forces operate in tandem. Revelation 12 mirrors this structure with remarkable precision. It depicts heavenly beings, the woman, the dragon, Michael and his angels, cosmic warfare, the battle in heaven, human communities caught in the crossfire, the woman's offspring, and divine protection of the covenant remnant, the woman nourished in the wilderness. The dragon's pursuit of the woman and his subsequent war against her remaining seed is therefore best understood not as a demonic rebellion, but as an act of jurisdictional enforcement, a celestial power attempting to reassert control over a population that has shifted allegiance to a rival authority. In this framework, the dragon is not an embodiment of metaphysical evil, but a territorial celestial entity whose authority has been bypassed, echoing the War Scroll's portrayal of cosmic powers locked in administrative and military conflict rather than moral dualism. This reading situates Revelation 12 firmly within the apocalyptic tradition of Qumran, where divine beings, human covenant communities, and cosmic territories intersect in a complex struggle for sovereignty. The child as a jurisdictional escapee. Revelation 12 presents the birth of the male child not as a moral triumph over evil, but as a jurisdictional transfer of authority. According to the search results, Revelation 12 verse 5 explicitly identifies the child as the one who will rule all the nations with a rod of iron, a direct allusion to Psalm 2 verses 7 to 9, where God grants his anointed son authority over the nations. The child is immediately caught up to God and to his throne, Revelation 12 verse 5, which the sources interpret as a reference to the ascension, symbolizing the Messiah's enthronement and removal from any earthly or hostile celestial jurisdiction. This act is not a battlefield victory over the dragon but a strategic extraction. The child is removed from the dragon's reach entirely, bypassing any attempt at confrontation. The dragon therefore loses jurisdiction over the child, who is now enthroned, over the woman, who flees into the wilderness under divine protection, Revelation 12 verses 6 and 14, and over the covenant lineage, which continues outside his domain. The search results emphasize that the dragon's attempt to devour the child mirrors Herod's attempt to kill the infant Messiah, Matthew 2 verses 16 to 18, demonstrating that the threat is administrative and territorial rather than metaphysical. Because the dragon is circumvented rather than defeated, his rage is directed toward the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 12 verse 17. In this reading, the child's ascension is not the overthrow of a cosmic enemy but the reassignment of authority, a transfer of sovereignty that removes the Messiah and his covenant people from the dragon's sphere of influence. The dragon's fury is therefore the fury of a displaced ruler, not a defeated demon. The remnant as non-compliant subjects. Revelation 12 verse 17 explicitly defines the remnant as those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast the testimony of Jesus. The search results emphasize that this group is not identified by moral superiority but by allegiance. They keep tau etero omega, terio, God's commandments, a verb meaning to guard, preserve, or maintain covenant loyalty, and they hold chi omicron nu tau omega nu, the testimony of Jesus, meaning they bear witness to him even under pressure or persecution. In a jurisdictional reading, these markers identify the remnant as humans who refuse the dragon's authority because they are loyal to a different sovereign. They are not good people in a moralistic sense. They are non-compliant covenant loyalists whose allegiance lies with the God of Israel and the Messiah rather than with the celestial power represented by the dragon. The search results reinforce this by noting that the dragon's fury is focused and directed specifically at those who embody covenant obedience and messianic witness. Thus, the dragon makes war on them not because he is metaphysically evil or because they are morally righteous, but because they exist outside his domain, refusing assimilation into the authority structure he represents. This aligns with the broader apocalyptic pattern in Revelation and Second Temple literature, where cosmic conflict is driven by competing sovereignties, not moral dualism. The remnant is targeted precisely because they are the surviving population that remains loyal to a rival ruler, the Messiah enthroned in heaven, and therefore constitute a direct challenge to the dragon's jurisdiction. The war is administrative, not moral. When Revelation 12 is read through the lens of Second Temple Jewish cosmology and the war scroll, 1 quadrant meter, the conflict described is best understood as administrative and jurisdictional, not moral or metaphysical. The war scroll explicitly depicts a structured conflict between divine administrations, where the congregation of the gods and the congregation of men shall engage one another in battle. This is not a war between abstract good and evil but a clash between territorial powers, each with defined authority, armies, and domains. The sons of light and the sons of darkness fight alongside their respective angelic commanders, demonstrating that allegiance, not moral purity, is the organizing principle of the conflict. Revelation 12 mirrors this structure. The dragon, Michael, the woman, and the remnant all operate within a cosmic hierarchy where authority and jurisdiction are the central issues. The dragon's expulsion from heaven, Revelation 12 verses 8-9, is described in the search results as the loss of place, or legal standing in the heavenly court, which reframes his subsequent actions as those of a displaced ruler attempting to reassert control. This is noted but is not the same flying serpent I saw. He was more like a guard. His pursuit of the woman and his war against her offspring, Revelation 12 verses 13-17, therefore function as a celestial enforcement action, a crackdown on a population that has defected to a rival sovereign, the enthroned Messiah. This aligns precisely with the War Scroll's portrayal of cosmic warfare, where angelic and human forces align according to covenantal loyalty rather than metaphysical categories of good and evil. In this framework, the dragon's rage is not the fury of a moral villain, but the frustration of a territorial power whose jurisdiction has been overridden, making the war in Revelation 12 an administrative struggle over sovereignty, allegiance, and cosmic governance. The interpretation in one line. Revelation 12 verse 17 can be understood, in a strict jurisdictional reading, as describing a celestial serpent being, a figure consistent with the serpentine seraph imagery found in the Hebrew Bible, attempting to enforce his authority against a group of humans who refuse his jurisdiction because their allegiance lies with Yeshua. The search results emphasize that the dragon is portrayed as a serpent, Revelation 12 verse 9, and that the remnant are defined not by moral purity but by covenant loyalty. They keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. In this framework, the conflict is not a metaphysical struggle between good and evil but a sovereignty dispute between competing authorities. Expanded conclusion. When Revelation 12 verse 17 is interpreted through the lens of Second Temple cosmology and the War Scroll, 1 quadrant meter, the entire narrative reorients away from later Christian demonology and back into its original apocalyptic framework. The search results emphasize that Revelation 12 sits at the center of John's apocalypse as a hinge between heavenly conflict and earthly persecution, which already signals that the chapter is structured around cosmic administration, not metaphysical dualism. In this context, the dragon is best understood not as a medieval devil figure, but as a seraphic or serpentine celestial power, consistent with the ancient Near Eastern and biblical imagery of fiery, winged serpent beings, cf. Isaiah 6, Numbers 21. The woman, identified in the search results as Israel through the symbolism of Joseph's dream, Genesis 37 verses 9-11, is not portrayed as the dragon's ideological enemy, but as a protected covenant lineage whose destiny lies outside his jurisdiction. Her preservation in the wilderness, Revelation 12 verses 6-14, mirrors the War Scroll's theme of God safeguarding his covenant community during cosmic upheaval. The child, caught up to God and to his throne, Revelation 12 verse 5, represents a transfer of authority, not a moral victory. The search results highlight that this enthronement imagery parallels imperial iconography familiar to first-century readers, reinforcing that the issue at stake is sovereignty, not good versus evil. The dragon's failure to devour the child is therefore a jurisdictional defeat. He is circumvented, not conquered. His subsequent expulsion from heaven, no longer was there any place for them in heaven, Revelation 12 verse 8, is described in the search results as the loss of legal standing in the heavenly court, again underscoring the administrative nature of the conflict. The remnant, defined as those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 12 verse 17, are not morally superior but non-compliant subjects whose allegiance has shifted to a rival sovereign. The war scroll provides the clearest parallel. It depicts angelic and human forces aligning according to covenantal loyalty, not metaphysical categories of good and evil. Do you send a good guy for a bad guy? Or do you send a well-equipped good guy to do bad for good? The search results confirm that Second Temple texts, such as 1 Enoch and 1 Quadrant Meter, portray Michael as the leader of God's armies in conflicts between divine powers, which Revelation directly echoes. Thus, the dragon's war against the remnant is best understood as a celestial enforcement action, an attempt by a displaced territorial power to reclaim authority over a population that no longer recognizes his rule. This reading is not only coherent but deeply aligned with the worldview of the period. It restores Revelation 12 to its original context, aka God's original plan, where cosmic beings, nations, and covenant communities interact within a complex hierarchy of jurisdictions. It also removes the later theological distortions that reframed this administrative conflict as a simplistic moral dualism between good and evil. In its original setting, Revelation 12 is a drama of competing sovereignties, not competing moralities, a struggle over authority, legitimacy, and cosmic governance. By returning to this framework, the text becomes clearer, more historically grounded, and more consistent with the apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple era. In the coming of Melchizedek, 11q13, the line, "Over it take your seat in the highest heaven, a divine being will judge the peoples," is the Qumran community's way of identifying Melchizedek as a heavenly, enthroned judge who presides over the final judgment. The scroll quotes Psalm 7 verses 7 to 8 and applies it not to God directly, but to Melchizedek, treating him as a divine figure who sits in the highest heaven and executes judgment over nations and supernatural beings. In this text, Melchizedek is not a human priest, but a cosmic ruler who leads the heavenly host, defeats Belial, the chief of the forces of darkness, proclaims the final jubilee, and liberates the righteous. The phrase "take your seat in the highest heaven" signals enthronement, placing Melchizedek within the divine council described in passages like Psalm 82, where heavenly beings deliberate and judge. By calling him a divine being who will judge the peoples, the scroll elevates Melchizedek to the role of God's appointed agent of justice, the one who carries out the final reckoning at the end of days. In short, this line means that Melchizedek is portrayed as a heavenly judge and ruler, seated in the highest realm, executing judgment over both nations and spiritual powers, a role later associated with the Messiah in early Christianity. So in there we can see the mixture again, but what is notable to myself is the seer, or in these words the prophet. Today's Bible reads the return of Jesus, other have reincarnation stories, as well. Also following this framework, most scientists today use the examples from the Tibetan monks. So we can assume the one with the final vote may just be a normal tribe member. Well, if you call any of this ideology normal, that is. Explanation of 11q13, column 17 to 18. In the coming of Melchizedek, 11q13, the interpretation of the passage about the mountains and the messengers reflects the Qumran community's method of reading scripture through an apocalyptic, symbolic lens. When the text says the mountains are the prophets, it means that the prophets of Israel, figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, are metaphorically described as towering, immovable structures because they carried divine authority and proclaimed God's truth to the entire nation. Their role was foundational, elevated, and enduring, just as mountains dominate the landscape. The next phrase, "the messengers is the anointed of the Spirit," identifies a specific figure who is more than a prophet, a Spirit-anointed deliverer. The scroll explicitly links this figure to Daniel 9 verse 26, which speaks of an anointed one who shall be cut off. In the Qumran interpretation, this anointed of the Spirit is not a generic prophet, but a messianic or heavenly figure whose mission is tied to the end-time deliverance of Israel. By quoting Daniel, the scroll signals that this anointed one's suffering, cut off, is part of the divine plan leading to the final Jubilee, the defeat of Belial, and the restoration of God's rule. Thus in this passage, the prophets, mountains prepare Israel through their warnings and revelations, while the Anointed One, messenger, is the climactic agent of salvation whose appearance marks the turning point of the age. The text uses these symbols to show that the prophetic tradition culminates in a spirit-empowered figure whose mission fulfills Daniel's prophecy and inaugurates Melchizedek's final act of judgment and liberation. In the War Scroll, 1 quadrat meter. From Qumran, the term sons of darkness is not a moral label but a geopolitical and cosmic category describing the human and supernatural forces aligned under Belial, the chief adversarial power in the Qumran worldview. The scroll lists specific nations: Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, the sons of the east often linked with Amalek, the Philistines, and the Kittim, as members of Belial's army. These groups were not chosen randomly, each represents a traditional enemy of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, symbolizing long-standing political hostility and spiritual opposition. In the War Scroll's apocalyptic imagination, these nations become embodied extensions of Belial's authority, forming the earthly component of his army. The Kittim, often associated with Western imperial powers, represent the dominant foreign empire of the era, making them the ultimate military force on the side of darkness. Together, these groups form the Army of Belial, a coalition of hostile nations and spiritual powers that stand in opposition to the Sons of Light, the covenant community led by the Archangel Michael. The scroll frames the final conflict not as a moral struggle between good and evil individuals, but as a cosmic war between divine administrations, with these nations serving as the human agents of Belial's dominion. They are historical tribes or nations. Every group listed is a real people group from the Hebrew Bible. Edom, descendants of Esau. Moab, descendants of Lot. Ammon, descendants of Lot. Sons of the East/Amalek, nomadic tribal coalitions, Amalek as a hostile clan. Philistines, coastal people of Canaan. Kittim, originally Cyprus/Greek peoples, later used for Western imperial powers, often Rome. In the War Scroll, 1 quadrat meter, the groups listed under the banner of the Sons of Darkness: Edom, Moab, the sons of Ammon, the sons of the East/Amalekites, the Philistines, and the bands of Kittim, are indeed historical tribes and nations, but the scroll uses them in a much deeper and more symbolic way. These peoples were long-standing enemies of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, and the Qumran community reinterpreted them as the earthly representatives of Belial's dominion, forming what the text calls the Army of Belial. Rather than describing them as morally evil individuals, the scroll treats these nations as geopolitical and cosmic proxies, meaning they are human embodiments of a larger spiritual administration opposed to the covenant community. Each group carries a specific historical memory of hostility toward Israel, and the War Scroll transforms that history into an apocalyptic framework where these nations collectively represent the human side of Belial's authority structure. The Kittim, often associated with powerful Western empires, serve as the dominant military force among them, symbolizing imperial oppression. Together, these nations form the structural opposition to the Sons of Light, not because of moral wickedness, but because they belong to a rival jurisdiction in the cosmic order envisioned by the Qumran sect. In the Hebrew Bible and in texts like the War Scroll, the word Gentile, Hebrew, goy, goyim, does not refer to a specific tribe or ethnic lineage. Instead, it is a broad category meaning the nations, essentially, everyone outside the 12 tribes of Israel. A Gentile could be Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Persian, Philistine, Edomite, Moabite, or any other people group. The term does not describe ancestry but covenantal status. Israel is the covenant people, and the Gentiles are the nations outside that covenant structure. In the Qumran worldview, Gentiles are not a single tribe but a collective designation for all non-Israelite peoples, often grouped under the authority of foreign powers or cosmic rulers like Belial. So when ancient texts speak of Gentiles, they are not identifying a tribe, they are identifying everyone who is not part of Israel's tribal system. And this is why that last part is incorrect. In Romans, when Paul speaks of the Gentile being first and also last, he is not referring to a tribe or lineage but to the order of God's dealings with humanity in salvation history. Paul's entire argument in Romans 1-3 is that God shows no partiality, both Jews and Gentiles stand under judgment, and both receive access to mercy. When he says the gospel is first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, Romans 1 verse 16, he means that Israel received the covenant, the prophets, and the Messiah first in historical sequence. But later in Romans, especially chapters 9-11, Paul explains that Gentiles, who were once last and outside the covenant, are now being brought in ahead of Israel in terms of response and faithfulness. In other words, the Gentiles become first in receiving the message, while Israel becomes last in accepting it. This reversal echoes Jesus saying, "The last will be first, and the first last," which Paul applies to the Jew-Gentile relationship. The Gentile is not a tribe, it is a category of nations, and Paul uses first and last to describe the Gentile is a tribe, it is a category of nations, and Paul uses first and last to describe the reversal of covenant order, not ancestry. Israel was first in receiving revelation, but Gentiles become first in responding to it, creating a paradox where the outsider becomes the insider and the insider becomes the outsider, until the final restoration Paul predicts in Romans 11. Author's notes. To its mythic political context, where cosmic being, to those who are trying to block me instead of being friends. We are not the same. I am the type that you will see here. And there. He coming of Melchizedek, column 4. Scripture also says about him, "Over it take your seat in the highest heaven, a divine being will judge the peoples."
Of fire.
Ancient Mesopotamian tablets talk about cherub throne guardians and describe them as snakes and dragons. The Serpent of Eden was actually a supernatural being whose job was to guard God's throne. An ancient person would have known the scene was about a rebel in the divine council.